We'll move on to Monsieur Lamoureux.
I appreciate the quick answers. I can tell you, I don't think that there is anyone outside of the government that is actually proposing that we get rid of vouching. And so it's reassuring when we hear from nonprofits or independent groups coming before the committee, just reinforcing how critically important it is that we retain vouching. And I understand that there might be some need for some amendment or ways in which we can maybe modify it, but you don't have to kill vouching. That's an important aspect to our democracy. I wanted to pick up on the robocalls, because that is an issue that tens of thousands of Canadians are very familiar with, to the degree in which literally thousands of phone calls were made to Elections Canada because of what had taken place. One of the biggest criticisms towards the election bill was that Elections Canada was not being afforded the opportunity to compel witnesses. I think, Mr. Fox, you had indicated something to the effect of what happens to you if you get caught. Getting caught can be a problem for the simple reason is they just have to say no comment. They don't have to show up. My question to you is, how important do you think it is that Elections Canada or the Commissioner have the ability to compel a witness to provide testimony?
I think giving the investigator the ability to compel witnesses would be a positive addition to the bill.
Okay. The other issue that I'm not too sure who raised it, it might have been you, Mr. Fox, and I think it's an issue that we don't hear enough about, is the whole issue of privacy. We do have these huge data banks. All political parties have data banks. It's very limited in terms of what's there to protect the voters on this particular issue. How would you recommend, or who should oversee? Is it something that it should be the Privacy Commissioner? Should it be Elections Canada? How do we protect the voters with these data banks, in your opinion?
I'll leave it to experts to make a definitive view on that. I would say the expertise currently resides at the Privacy Commission, so I would start there. And I think looking at the Privacy Act and extending certain provisions to political party activity without, and I think it's important to say, without going all the way to preventing political parties from communicating with voters or knowing more about us. I think it's important for democratic activity to make sure that political parties can do that legitimately and without a too heavy regulatory burden. But it is almost nonsense in the information age that we're allowed to keep those databases without any kind of oversight about what happens to information that's about us.
Yeah, and I think that's the major point here. And in fact, something could have been incorporated into the legislation that at the very least would have dealt with the issue. Fair comment?
Fair comment, and I would say a separate bill could deal with that as well, but it's definitely a policy gap that we identified, that others have identified, and that needs to be dealt with.
Right. Mr. Gunn, I had read your part of your report, and it was interesting. On February the 17th, 2004, you make reference to a resolution, and this is when it states, and I'll quote right from it, that the House direct the Chief Electoral Officer and Elections Canada to expand its initiatives to promote the participation of young Canadians in the electoral process, and that these initiatives include making available educational material to schools and other organizations and supporting parallel voting opportunities for prospective electors during federal elections, including making available polling materials and publications of results of such parallel voting, and that Elections Canada work creatively with such groups as Kids Voting Canada, Scouts Canada, Guides Canada, teachers and others, and provide regular reports on these matters to the House of Commons through the Standing Committee on Procedural and House Affairs. So there was, and this is something that was supported by all parties back in 2004. Now, this legislation does not do that, and I'm wondering if you might want to provide comment on that.
I put this in just because it was hard-earned to engage Elections Canada at the beginning to do this. This has been a 10-year effort, and they said no to us many times, and it might have just been that they weren't yet ready to interpret the existing Section 18 as something that would allow them to, say, work with future electors, like what we were proposing. And luckily, MPs in the House disagreed, and they basically told Elections Canada at that time to work with us. That name, Kids Voting Canada, was the first name we came up with. So they put that in it, and the very next day, we received a call from Elections Canada asking us to go to Ottawa and meet with the Chief Election Officer to begin to speak about how they could potentially support us. And I'd like to point out, too, they didn't always support the entire cost of the student vote program. It started with in-kind contributions, no cash towards our time, for example, and through much heavy negotiation is probably a polite way to put it, and also an accident of the 2008 federal election falling on Labor Day weekend, which I don't think they were prepared for. They had to, if they wanted us to operate, cover the full cost, and now since that time they've done so.
Yeah, and I guess I raise it because we have seen a flip-flop in attitude from the government. At one time, they supported Elections Canada, and they voted to go out, reach out for Elections Canada. And today what we're seeing is quite the opposite. All four presenters articulated on how important it is that Elections Canada have the ability to communicate with the public. And if the amendment is not brought forward, could you see this as good legislation by tying the hands of Elections Canada in any form if that amendment does not succeed? And just a very quick yes, no from each presenter would be much appreciated, or 3-second comment. Yes.
I think I made my position on that clear in their remarks.
We need to preserve the public education function for sure.
That's what I said. I think it's not going to be good for Canada if Elections Canada cannot continue in a public education function.
And I agree, and I also think in my remarks I tried to strengthen it further by arguing that they could actually be doing a better job. I think there's been some concerns articulated. Mr. Reid, who was here earlier, I heard him articulate some concerns about the advertising earlier, and I think if we had a more rigorous approach of assessing what worked and didn't and have that shared, I think we could make amendments to encourage that sort of behavior that might even strengthen it further.
Thank you very much. Again, I caution the members about asking complex questions with 2 seconds left in their round. Mr. Richards, for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm going to follow along on the education part of it as well here. I think what we're talking about is voter turnout, and we're talking about the education and the information. And I think there's two things that drive voter turnout. And that's, I think the first one is motivation to vote, and the second one is information about voting. So obviously information is the responsibility of Elections Canada. That's quite clear, you know, letting people know how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. And it's their own data show that they've been doing a fairly poor job of it. After the last election, when talking to young non-voters, there was reports of not knowing where to vote. 25% of them saying not knowing where to vote. 26% not knowing when to vote, or 19% not knowing how to vote. So obviously that would have played a role in their decision not to vote. So that's obviously a barrier there. And I wanted to just ask Mr. Gunn, maybe Ms. Loat, I want to ask you both to be quite brief because I've only got 3 minutes left at this point. And I wonder if you could just give us a bit of your sense, because that tells us about the information part of it, but the motivation part is the part I'd like to ask you about. Can you give us any insights on your feelings on what motivates a person to vote? Obviously the approach of Elections Canada, there's millions of dollars spent in the last several years, and it doesn't seem to be working. So tell us what your feelings are, just again briefly, what motivates someone to vote.
Sure, Mr. Richards, I just had a problem hearing on that last one. I just wasn't sure if you're implying that the money spent on the student vote program wasn't working, or by Elections Canada on just outreach in general.
What I'm really asking you is just to tell me what motivates someone to vote in your opinion. Like what's the motivation?
I also would like to take this moment just to talk about, for a quick second, because that's probably all I have, Mr. Preston, is, and I may be either wrong or a total outlier on this, and I brought this up with you personally. I don't believe so much in the access or information barriers. I actually think that those, and I put them in a
I
category
have to,
called...
again, I'm sorry to, I have to ask you to be very brief. Like, if you
Sure,
get the point
okay.
of what
I call
motivates
those
them, yeah.
excuses. Those are excuses that people use if they are not going to vote or they didn't vote in an election. The real barrier is, I think, interest, knowledge, sense of civic duty. If you're interested in something, you're going to make it a priority.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you. I'll have to stop
Sure.
you just because I want to allow Ms. Loat, and I do have one follow-up question for you both. So, very brief.
Terrific question. We run a program called Democracy Talks that works with young people and newcomers to Canada, and so we run focus group work with them. Three things that come up that on the motivation side that I think are deeper than what you can get at from some of the statistics that you've probably been presented. One is there's an overwhelming sentiment. These are people who don't participate. That voting.
Again, I remind you just to be very
Okay,
brief. I want to get a follow-up.
they don't see voting as something that's that Canadians value. It's not introduced to people in citizenship. It's not taught well, often in schools, with the exception of student vote. And many people say their friends and family have never encouraged them to do it. So that's one. Two, voting is not the first step for most people. Most people who have to engage,
I'm sorry,
and thirdly, it has to come from a trusted intermediary. So those are three further
Thank you.
barriers on
Thank you.
motivation.
I need to get to my second question. So I think
Sorry, it's a
talking
big
about
question.
talking about motivation, you know, I look at that really as being a role that, of us as political parties, as politicians, to encourage people and motivate them to get out and vote. I look at the last couple of elections in the United States, for example, and I think you would probably both agree with me. What motivated people to get out to vote there? It was being inspired by a politician, being inspired to get out and vote and be part of issues, and someone that inspires you. Would that be something you would agree with, yes or no?
So
The framework.
So just, I mean, there is a lot, there's research done on this. These are great questions. The candidate and the party absolutely matter. A secondary thing, though, where voter turnout went up where it hadn't before, was work that was done with intermediary organizations who had trusted relationships with people in communities. So I think it's not just candidates or just schools. It's the two together, and that's, I think, what's so critical about Section 18, is that, and there, I've made hopefully some good suggestions on that dimension that would allow both multi-partisan as well as non-partisan efforts be made to encourage greater participation.
Thank
Mr.
you
Richards,
very
our
much.